Dr. Jon Kirwan is an Associate Professor of Theology at Christendom College, where he serves as Director of the Christendom Institute for Advanced Studies and one of its divisions, the Christendom Center for Educational Philosophy and Leadership. He earned an M.Ed from the University of Massachusetts and a Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Oxford. His research focuses on 20th century French Catholic thought, and he has published 2 books on the subject. Before earning his doctorate, he spent many years teaching at the K-12 level in underserved areas, including South Los Angeles, the Navajo Indian Reservation, and East Africa. Additionally, he founded a successful long-running literacy program in Watts.
Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dr. Wheatley, Dr. Izquierdo. I love Florida. It's great to be down again. And my specialty is, and thank you for these 2 wonderful papers. It's hearing all of these names and these ideas. It's like running into old friends again, Joseph Pieper and C.S. Lewis and some of the founders. My specialty is progressive education. I work in basically the 20th century. Progressive education starts in 1890, and it's either ended or it's ongoing to this day, depending on who you ask. So it's a lot of fun for me to be able to connect the dots back to the founders. And one of the things that one of the unfortunate realities of our present day exchange over the state of education, what happened, who's to blame, and what's to be done, is that we're generally arguing about a number of superficial realities without getting to the most essential questions and the most important issues. We have all kinds of ideas about school choice and progressive ed, child-centered. We have opinions about outcomes and charter schools and on, and we've forgotten what they knew 100 years ago, that this was a question of anthropology. Remember, anthropology is the philosophy of human nature. Wherever your human nature goes, that's where your education goes. And don't worry, you won't need to think through the other things quite as deeply, because wherever you plant your flag on human nature, the other things are going to follow. Curriculum, teacher training, assessment, outcomes, on and on. You can't teach human beings unless you know what a human being is. So what I'm going to try to do in this paper is connect the dots of progressive education with one of the founders, John Adams. And so to do that, I'm going to briefly explore the dramatic change in attitudes and philosophies in education between 1896 and 1926. In just over a century, education, its aims, methods, curriculum, and outcomes was radically reconceived. How did so much change in such a short period of time happen? Shifting the philosophies, methods, and texts of the age of the founders to those of the progressive educators. This is, of course, a massive subject with many different philosophical, scientific, economic, industrial, religious, and cultural dimensions. But nonetheless, there's an important story to be told here, and I'll attempt to bridge these 2 distant eras by sketching the reception history of the famous pedagogical manual of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Emile, written in 1762. This book was almost entirely rejected, even mocked by many of the founders, yet it's revered as a kind of manifesto for modern progressive educators of our own day and even in the early 1900s. The great shift is certainly not entirely due to Rousseau, but I'm hoping to use his work as a kind of heuristic interpretive lens to bridge these 2 eras so that we can better determine in our own day what the stakes of the education debate really are in Florida and throughout the country. So in order to narrow the field to a relatively manageable size in 18 minutes, I'll examine mainly the thought of John Adams regarding Rousseau. They were contemporaries of some sort, and they're radically different conceptions of education. So first of all, for those of you who don't have a lot of familiarity with them, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712 to 1778. He was a philosopher from Geneva, and his most famous work, The Social Contract, and his educational manifesto, Emile, were both written in 1762. And he articulates a very influential version of natural human goodness, the general will, and education according to nature, profoundly shaping modern democratic thought and of course, as I mentioned, the foundations of progressive education. John Adams, as you know, 1735 to 1826. He's born 20 years after Rousseau, roughly. He's one of the American founders. He's a political theorist. He's a principal advocate of constitutional checks and balances. He's one of the main reasons we don't have one assembly where there's kind of a pure democracy. That's what the French wanted, and that's what they kept telling us we needed to have. And he labored day and night, so he tells us, it's debated, to write against this and to give us this very complex system of checks and balances. Now, why does he do that? Because he said, if you get human nature wrong, you're going to get politics wrong, and you're going to get the republic wrong. And the system that we have of checks and balances, he argues, it best reflects and is best shaped to a realistic understanding of who the human person is. C. Bradley Thompson writes that Adams played so many important roles at such critical points in the movement for independence and in the formation of the national polity that to misunderstand his thought and deeds is to misunderstand the founding. Okay, so we have our two protagonists, Adams and Rousseau, who are going to be, we're going to kind of frame them as figureheads or, kind of fountainheads from which these two streams, we call it classical education, we can call it liberal education. Adams would just say it's human education versus progressive education on the other side. Begins in 1890. We all think, it's kind of just footnotes to John Dewey. It's not footnotes to John Dewey. There was four streams all fighting it out. John Dewey and his disciples basically lost. The John Dewey is, kind of child experience. No teacher is moved. The teacher is no longer sage on a stage, guide on the side, and the child's experience becomes central. Okay, so let me just kind of offer a definition for each of these. So the founding era, the educational philosophy of the American founders, very broad, kind of ham-fisted, but let's just get a definition here. The American founders broadly championed liberal education centered on trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, whether they called it that. It was roughly framed in that way. Study of Latin and Greek, and the great literary, historical, and philosophical texts, because they believed these works revealed the realities of human nature, its capacities, passions, and weaknesses and possibilities, and thereby formed the character, prudence, and civic virtue necessary for Republican self-government and history. Remember, they're big on history. Why are they big on history? Well, that's going to factor into the conclusion of this paper. And this is something that's largely been expunged from the curriculum. There's been so much written about how our students don't know history. I've taught hundreds and hundreds of college freshmen. I can attest to this. You cannot mention the Roman Empire without hyperbole. You can't mention the Roman Empire and assume that really out of a class of 30 freshmen and sophomores, anyone really knows it, much less Assyria and Babylon. So it's hard to even have this kind of, establish this kind of context. Progressive education. Progressive educators, however, reconceived education as scientific and social progress aimed at adapting the child to democratic society through experience and social problem solving rather than through the transmission of a classical tradition, often grounded, they were, in an optimistic belief in inevitable historical progress and in philosophical assumptions that deny objective truth. Okay? There's no correspondence of the mind to reality. There's no confrontation with this intelligible reality. Dr. Benitez was just talking about C.S. Lewis and the waterfall. There's none of this. It's simply, we are constructing a kind of reality in our heads, and this is all post-Kantian thought. If you have a little background on the subject, they were often at odds over principles and ends of education, but nonetheless they had one common thing that kept them together long enough before the utilitarians and the job training crowd and the behavioral scientists won out, and that was defeating traditional classical or liberal education. That's what united them. That's what kept them going from 1890 until they really had control of the whole thing by 1940. Okay, let's very briefly talk about Rousseau. Rousseau's very briefly, Rousseau inverts human nature. Human beings are born naturally good, and it's society that corrupts human beings. So he comes up with a radical theory of education in his book Emile. And Emile is this young man who grows up and he receives kind of an ideal education. Well, there's really no education, there's no external conformity, there's no discipline imposed, there's no authoritative coercion, there's nothing until roughly age 12 to 15. So you never tell the kid really, I mean never in scare quotes, but what to do. You don't discipline the child, whatever they want to experience. And so it's this maximal notion of freedom, not in the sense that we just heard, but freedom to do whatever you want. And he comes up with this idea that through play and experiment and maximizing freedom, then we will be able to adapt truly to society, right? And he comes up with this 4-stage theory about when we educate and what we need to educate for. And history is out. When you do teach it at age 15, it's merely kind of some moral fables. There's never chronologies. There's never kind of a history of the rise and fall of empires or things like that. And so this is Rousseau, and he comes up with a political philosophy. This is basically his educational philosophy undergirds political philosophy. If we can raise children like this, then we will be able to create a kind of perfect republic, which is a pure democracy. Okay? So this is really influential on a number of levels in progressive ed, even up to Piaget. If some of you have labored through a Master of Education and a mainstream education, you know the whole stages of development and all of these things. Highly contested theory, influential even to our own day in various aspects. Okay, but let's. What he does is he overturns the moral order. So human beings are fundamentally good. Well, this goes against not only the Christian ethos, but also the classical ethos that human beings are born fatally flawed. And whether you have a robust notion of original sin or merely kind of a softer version of human weakness, as maybe the Greeks had, right? Either way, it's education. Human beings are born flawed and weak, but with great potential and desperately in need of moral formation and true education to train the intellect, to discipline the mind, and we do this through literature. You could read Russell Kirk's magnificent essay on forming the moral imagination through literature. History is the great teacher of human nature, teaches us about human weakness, on and on. We need this. Grammar helps us shape our minds to reality, right? We learn to think correctly. We learn to compose thoughts in a coherent manner. Syntax helps us with the efficiency of those things. So, how do we know John Adams? What do the founders think about Rousseau? Well, the founders dismissed Rousseau. They didn't talk much about him because they didn't take him seriously. And as influential as Rousseau was in France, he wasn't very influential in America, although the American founders certainly knew who he was. John Adams is one of the most intellectually inclined of the founders. And John Adams, what he thinks about Rousseau is usually in the marginalia of his books on Rousseau in his library, and he's unsparing in his criticism of Rousseau, and he thinks Rousseau simply has kind of lost his mind in this naivety. The ideas of education held by the American founders could not have been more different from those of Rousseau, whom they often regarded as dangerously naive about human nature and even politically subversive. His educational vision in Emile therefore stood in sharp contrast to their own commitment to liberal education grounded in history, moral philosophy, and the formation of virtue, necessary for Republican self-government. The founders rejected Rousseau because of his romantic optimism about human nature and his belief that social institutions and traditions corrupt what is naturally good in man, a view they regarded as dangerously at odds with historical evidence. They didn't like his abstractions. They said he's clearly not grounded in history or reality. They said it's no coincidence that he doesn't like history. And so they were dangerously at odds with the historical evidence of human weakness and the need for moral formation through religion, law, and liberal education. Now, So what does John Adams think about human nature? Remember, wherever you plant your flag on human nature, there your educational philosophy will unravel. Your pedagogy, your methodology, your assessment, on and on. And you won't need to worry. We won't need to get our opinions from whichever news sources that we consume. While Rousseau begins with natural innocence corrupted by society, Adams is a realist and begins with a morally mixed nature requiring disciplined law and institutional restraint. Human beings are fundamentally weak, and few can overcome the temptations of power and the tendency of self-love deeply rooted in our nature. Yet human beings are also capable of great virtue, and this inconsistency persistently perplexed Adams, who was very much a student of human nature by reading through history. One scholar writes that he knew well that human beings embody the most perplexing, often marvelous and disturbing inconsistencies. Thus, his wary view of human nature, which he viewed as fundamentally stable, To the progressive educators who deny our ability to know natures, to know what things really are, human beings are going to be organisms, or for the social efficiency industrialists, you are merely a unit, and they call you a unit. You might be a behaviorally modified organism, like the behavioral scientists say, or you might be an experiential organism, but you're never a person, and you're certainly never imago Dei. Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, "Human nature, with all its infirmities and deprivation, is still capable of great things. It is capable of attaining to degrees of wisdom and of goodness, which we have reason to believe appear respectable in the estimation of superior intelligences." Thus, it is no surprise that Adams is severe regarding Amiel's philosophical starting point, which is, quote unquote, capitals, state of nature. He wrote, "Reasoning from a state of nature," this kind of abstract nature where Amiel develops, this kind of hypothetical postulate of what could be if we could just take society away. Reasonings from a state of nature are fallacious because hypothetical. We have not facts. Experiments are wanting. Reasonings from savage life are not much better. Remember, Rousseau has the noble savage thing. Every writer affirms what he pleases. We have not facts to be depended on. He continues, the state of nature, the savage life, the Chinese happiness have all been falsely celebrated and cried up in order to lessen the reverence for Christian religion. And he goes on and on. He has beautiful things to say. And so education there fundamentally has to take stock of human weakness, right? Now, and so for Adams, it's history that is going to be the locus for doing that. When you go back to history, it's going to continually remind you of the fatal flaws of humanity, but yet our ability to rise up and do marvelous things, and especially in the Christian context, under the aspect especially of grace and redemption. So Adams' own education was itself thoroughly classical, raised in the New England grammar school tradition and educated at Harvard. This was just what education was then. His parents didn't have to get him into a charter school or something. He received a rigorous liberal education centered on Latin and Greek, authors, rhetoric, logic, history, and moral philosophy, studies he believed cultivated the knowledge of human nature, prudence, and virtue necessary for Republican leadership. For Adams, the Constitution indeed shapes the character of the people and therefore needs to be developed. Okay, so Adams is a history buff. Okay, no. Adams is not just a history buff, because when Rousseau and the French philosophes started intervening in the American debates between 1884, actually the late 1870s, between 1883 and 1884, and 1887 when the Constitutional Convention happens, it's John Adams, his understanding of history that in many respects, and I don't want to overstate this, in many respects saves the day. Because he's going up against whom? Thomas Paine, who's very much an idealist and is filtering this French idealist abstraction through a kind of common sense analysis. And so what does Adams do? Well, for Adams, the study of history occupied a central and vital place in liberal education because it was indeed the great teacher of human nature, weakness, and the potential for greatness. He wrote, To a man of liberal education, the study of history is not only useful and important, but altogether indispensable. In fact, Adams' lifelong study of history had a dramatic influence on the shaping of the American Constitution between the end of the Revolutionary War in 1783 and the beginning of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. There were 4 years of increasing instability, which some have even seen as bordering on a level of chaos that threatened the Republic, not an overstatement, as the Articles of Confederation proved inadequate for the time. So there were various conceptions of what form of government should take, and the influence of Rousseau and the philosophes was becoming increasingly prominent. Well, so I can get to my conclusion and stay within the 20-minute boundaries. He writes most of what he writes is letters that are compiled later, but his big 3-volume work is a defense of constitutions. And in volume 1, which he says he's laboring day and night to get out before the start of the convention, it's a kind of historical tour de force, 400 pages long, going through the rise and the falls of empires and republics and systems of government, showing how utterly complex they are and how if they're not if they're not shaped according to human nature, they will invariably fall apart. This has a dramatic effect. It has its influence implicitly on the Federalist Papers, and it makes it into, and many of the Founding Fathers are reading this. Well, Adams kind of saves the day, and we do get this kind of elaborate system of checks and balances, which Adams really develops from Montesquieu and argues corresponds best to the complexities of human nature, and he argues this historically through this kind of causal analysis of exactly what makes republics and forms of government and empires rise and fall. Well, Adams kind of saves the day, and all is well. But inexplicably, through a number of very complex circumstances, we have the Gilded Age, the Industrial Age, the beginnings of the Progressive Age, the end of kind of Orthodox Christianity in America, the rise of the social gospel movement. Through a number of things, Rousseau's Emile becomes quite avant-garde and influential in the end of the 1800s. And it's kind of a shocking and unexpected turn, but there it is. And the one who ushers it in, G. Stanley Hall, writes that the guardians of the young strive first of all, teachers, to keep out of nature's way and to prevent harm and should merit the proud title of defenders of the happiness and the rights of children. John Dewey goes on, arguing that Rousseau is the founder. Now, he filters this through this kind of pragmatism of the late 1800s, but very much explicit. Rousseau is the founder of child-centered education, and Rousseau will teach us to throw off the bonds of what we call now drill and kill and this kind of rote, ultradisciplinarian method, which is fundamentally hung up on some abstract and irrelevant notions of virtue and metaphysical claims about reality. And so I will conclude in 1926, this kind of comes to a head because in 1926, the curriculum movement is born. 30 years after the birth of progressive education, they have an anthropology, and now they're getting their hands on curriculum. And the curriculum movement said that all curriculum needs to be oriented toward the experience of the child, it needs to be fundamentally usable, and it needs to be relevant to their everyday experience, and it needs to be measurable. There is no more virtue. There's no more reading Tacitus. There's no more reading Herodotus to gain a wonder and an awe of human experience across cultures. There's no reading the Aeneas about justice and duty. Reading the Aeneid about justice and duty. Not all that's gone. It all has to be practical and experiential. Well, the great result of that is that history is expunged from the curriculum. And they kind of, and I'm going to be a little bit polemical here, but it's not untrue. They manufacture this discipline out of thin air called social studies. And it's this idea that, okay, we'll teach history, but it's only going to be in accords with the modern demands of curriculum, and we're going to blend it with politics, and we're going to blend it with economics and social life. And we're only going to teach history insofar as it's relevant to today's experience of the youth, and it's fundamentally useful for job training and progress. In this way, Adams and Jean-Jacques Rousseau represent two divergent paths forward in the next chapter of American education. One rooted in the classical study of history, philosophy, and the enduring realities of human nature for the formation of character and leadership, and the other increasingly oriented towards social reconstruction that sees nothing past utility, the shifting demands of modern life, and the experience of the child. As Dewey himself said, the child is the beginning and the end of education. Thank you.
Join us in falling in love with America again.